Hi, my name is Jordan Gloyd, and Christian County Library is excited to have a conversation with author, podcaster, producer, journalist, professor, Kate Winkler Dawson. Hi, Kate. Thanks for being here with us today.
Thank you. That was exhausting, listing everything that I do. Just hearing the list is a lot.
You do a lot.
I do a lot.
When we were first reading your biography, when we wanted to interview you, I think we were all kind of impressed and a little bit intimidated about the idea of talking to somebody who has such a really incredible resume.
Thank you. No intimidation needed, though, really. It's, I feel like I'm just like anybody else. I just happen to find things that I love to do, and there's just such a wide variety. There's not enough one life for me to get everything in, and so I just, I juggle as much as I can.
That is fantastic, really, and it's great that you have so many interests and specialities, because it seems like they kind of cross over with each other, including in this new book that you've written. So for those viewers who perhaps haven't read it, what can you tell us about your latest book, American Sherlock?
Sure. So American Sherlock came out in February, and the paperback comes out this coming February. And it's about a forensic scientist who, I usually say, it was sort of lost in the shadows. He's been relegated to the shadows of history. He was a forensic scientist who was one of the pioneers of forensics tools starting in the 1920s. And, nobody knows anything about him. He has no Wikipedia page and this incredible archive at the University of California at Berkeley. And he was just undiscovered, and I was very lucky to discover him. His name was Edward Oscar Heinrich, but he went by Oscar. And he was this man who was driven to solve crimes. He was driven to support his family, to, I think, juggle a lot of different things, because he had OCD. Pretty clearly he had OCD if you look at his archive. And he just had this sort of need to push things forward in the world of forensics, thank goodness, because some of the things that he did were pretty incredible. And I was really grateful, to really be able to jump into his life.
It is a really fascinating read. And in fact, librarians, we do a lot of what we call reader's advisory. We find out what books people like so that we can recommend other things that they might like, books, music, movies, all that kind of thing. So what are some good comparison titles of books or movies that if somebody liked them, they would probably like American Sherlock?
Well, I think the easiest comparison is Sherlock Holmes. Anything that, any Arthur Conan Doyle or any of the TV series, certainly like any of the CSI stuff, anything that's a mystery. So the way that this book is set up is, my first book, if I go back a second, my first book was called Death in the Air. And the first book was about one event, which was the Great Smog of 1952. And all of these people who were in that event. So, a doctor and, a serial killer and, a young girl, police officer. I wanted to do the opposite here. I wanted to take the several crimes and show it through the lens of this one person, who was Oscar Heinrich. And so each chapter is a big deep dive into a different one of his cases. So it's not like this dry biography of this man, which would not be dry because he's amazing, but it is a lot about the cases. And so, you find out about his struggles and how these cases unfold. And then, throughout the book, you see with each case what he learns, mistakes. He made a lot of mistakes. A lot of mistakes that he made that, affected his personal life. And so, I think that the way the book is structured it is like one big mystery. It's the mystery of this man's life, but it's also, these individual mysteries with the cases that he tackled.
Yeah, and each one is fascinating and really brought home to me how human nature has always been so varied and some of these crimes are ingenious, and I could definitely see them taking place on, a CSI or BBC Sherlock today, because some of these criminals are really quite smart, or they've done big things very stupidly. And it was
Well,
really interesting to read.
I was just talking to somebody, a student of mine today, who's doing a story on a killer from the 1800s, and he was asking me about, what was crime fighting like in the 1800s? And I said, feudal. I mean, it was really easy to get away with murder in the 1800s. And Oscar worked from 1910 until 1953 when he died. So this was a time when it was really difficult to be a cop. I mean, they leaned really heavily on the third degree, which is a real thing. The third degree was, them physically intimidating witnesses until they confessed. And so, what I told the student was there's an awful lot of people who were wrongfully convicted and an awful lot of people who got away with murder. So it was an exciting time for Oscar to start developing all of these tools in order to combat the sneaky criminal, as I like to call them. They were getting smarter, and they were becoming better experts in. I mean, Oscar had bomb cases. He actually, in his archive, had pieces from a bomb, shrapnel from a bomb, from one of his cases. Criminals were using more chemicals and different types of poisons. So he understood toxicology. And he was really unique because he was a criminalist who was also a generalist. So now you have experts, a lot of them who are siloed. You have ballistics experts, you have toxicology experts, people who know fingerprinting, but Oscar knew all of it. He knew like 25 different disciplines. So, and he was professionally trained, is what made him unique. He was a chemical engineer. So, he was a chemist. He really had the expertise. A lot of these guys who would get on the stand and oppose him just didn't have the same chops that he did.
I was surprised to read how even now there's not always great training or certifications for the people who are supposed to be solving these crimes, and yet Oscar Heinrich had all of this expertise wrapped up in one person, and in fact he pioneered so many of these methods that we still use. So I'm curious, what inspired you to start researching Heinrich? Why him?
Well, I was reading in a book. I was looking for my next book, and I was reading in this book, which is essentially an encyclopedia of criminals from, seems like a silly book, but it's fascinating, from the Pilgrims to the 1970s. And I was flipping through the book, and I read about Oscar's most famous case. It's not my favorite case, but it's his most famous case, which is the Siskiyou train robbery, which happened in 1923 in Oregon. And it was his most famous case because it was a lot of, like I call, razzle dazzle of forensics. He had basically just a pair of overalls to work with that these train robbers had left behind. And federal agents looked over them and found almost no clues. They found a clue, but it was the wrong clue. They thought something was mechanic's grease, and so they arrested a mechanic, and it turned out to be something completely different. And Oscar was able to pull 20 or 30 different clues off of that same pair of overalls. And so that's what earned him the nickname America's Sherlock Holmes. And I'm a Sherlock Holmes fan. So when I was reading the book and I spotted this moniker in the book, I thought this might be, the right guy for me to do a book on. And I kind of go through this checklist when I'm looking for a book of things that I think are important for me. I need to really be interested in the time period, because this isn't just about him. It's about, where are we in time? Like, what are people eating? How is Christmas, or what are the holidays that are celebrated? I'm trying to build a world. And 1920s is just like the best time in America. I mean, it's the Depression, it's the Roaring 20s, and it was Prohibition, and then the Roaring 20s, and then the Depression, which is like, you can't think of three different varying time periods. Incredible. So, to pick this section of the book, that section of time to work with this book, really allowed me to do a lot. I love San Francisco. I tend to write books about places I've lived. So my first book was set in London. I lived in London. This book was set in Northern California. I lived in San Francisco for quite a while. So, I loved that area. I loved the weather. You have to really be able to give people sort of a visceral reaction, and they have to really like feel that they're there. And for me, that involves a lot of visits or having lived there beforehand. So, there was a lot of pluses with this book. And on top of that, nobody had heard of him. And then on top of that, his archive was huge. He had a massive collection. I had to beg UC Berkeley to open it because it was so big, and it took them 2 years to catalog. And I just had access to bomb parts and pieces of hair that were part of evidence, and I mean all kinds of his glasses. I was able to pick up his glasses. So a lot of things that I think most authors really rely on in order to build a world for the reader.
Yeah, would you talk about the archive? The prologue opens with this scene of you handling his possessions, even bits of crime scenes, like you're holding, skull fragments.
Yeah.
Could you talk about the archive and its importance in helping you write the book?
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, I came from a visual world. I was a documentary filmmaker and I was a television news producer for a very long time. So being able to put on paper without showing very many photos, there are a lot of photos in the book, but to be able to paint a scene for a reader, I think you really have to be able to, like, the sights and the smells are really important. In my first book, somebody described the Great Smog of 1952 as smelling like rotten eggs in a wooden barrel. I mean, that's very specific, and I think a lot of people can relate to that. So I was looking for those sorts of things in this book, and an archive is a great place to look. So with Oscar, he was, I'm sure, OCPD for sure. He hoarded an unbelievable amount of stuff that I call productive hoarding. So it wasn't like random napkins. It was random napkins that were part of his notes from a crime scene. And he was fairly well organized, but he had stacks and stacks of leather-bound journals where he chronicled every penny that he spent. And he did this for 45 years, 50 years maybe. And so, these stacks of leather-bound journals to me spoke a very clear language, which was, this is somebody who desperately was trying to stay in control of something. And it took me a long time to figure out what he was doing. And I finally figured out that his father died when Oscar was very young. Oscar was the one who found him. It was very traumatic. And his father died because, of finances that they were in. And this would turn into a fear that Oscar had his entire life. He often said that he feared the bank more than he did the criminals who he was, responsible for convicting. And so that archive, without going into that archive, I would not have been able to figure that out. Without being able to see all of the things that he kept, like he kept his urine levels for like 2 years. I mean, he was so specific about the things that he wanted. He was a great photographer. So the photos in the book are his, and they're amazing. And I just think that, like, without going to an archive and seeing those sort of things, to be able to see his glasses, to see, he had kept the locket that was around the neck of a woman who had been run over by her own limousine 6 times. Somebody ran her over. Somebody wanted this woman dead for sure.
Oh my gosh.
And he kept the locket. And it was crazy. Like he had a piece of wax, and I kept trying to figure out what it was. And I finally found the label. It was a piece of wax that he had taken a bullet out of someone's heart and then tried to do a wax imprint of what that hole in that. I don't know. I don't understand why he did that, but he had it, and it was important to him. So those are all puzzle pieces. And when you're an author, that's what you do. You're a puzzle maker. You're trying to put that puzzle together, and you have to do that. Otherwise, the audience is going to feel that it's going to feel like they're reading a dry book, and you don't want that. You want compelling storytelling where you could feel and you could smell and you can relate to it. And if it's creepy, you feel creeped out. And that was all a big goal for me here.
I really like that you described it as puzzle pieces, because that's also kind of what Heinrich is doing. He has all these puzzle pieces. He's trying to reconstruct a crime, which of course brings me back to, okay, Sherlock Holmes is the most famous detective who never lived. And Heinrich is called over and over in his career the American Sherlock. So what are some of the parallels? They have incredible, sort of forensic sense, but what are some of the parallels between these two men?
I think there's a lot. I mean, they both like to smoke pipes. They both collected all different types of tobacco. They were both, I mean, I'm sorry, Oscar, incredibly arrogant, very, very arrogant. And I think that you almost have to be in that situation. Oscar was on the stand, very snide in some ways. He was very scientific, and that came back to bite him later on. I mean, he was dealing with jurors who, many of them didn't have college educations or high school educations. And he was really, using a very complicated language that just was lost on people. So I think that he talked over people, which I think Holmes probably did a lot of. And I think that he felt like he was smarter than police officers, which he was, and Holmes was too, right? And so I think that there's this mystique around both of these men, this like sort of aura of someone who transcends the rest of us. And that's really annoying sometimes. It was annoying to read some of Oscar's letters because, you can see someone who understands the criminal world so well and understands forensics and how to solve a crime and deconstructing a crime scene. And he understands human nature, but much like Sherlock Holmes, he just couldn't get a hold of like life, like real life, like relationships, like how to treat your sons well, like, I mean, picking the right woman. I mean, there's a lot that he missed. I think in this pursuit of creating a professional life, I think his personal life suffered quite a bit.
Well, one of the other comparisons that I noticed, and as a librarian was very thrilled to read about, was his, very long friendship with a reference librarian named John Boynton Kaiser. Yeah. Am I saying that right?
You are. You got it right. Yeah.
Excellent. So you're sort of portraying him as Heinrich's Dr. Watson. Can you talk about their relationship?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up John Boynton Kaiser, because a lot of people don't. I mean, he was very, very important. So Kaiser was a reference librarian, and kind of, I get the impression, sort of the rock star of reference librarians, which I didn't even know that in that world there would be. But he really wasn't. He was he was very important, and he actually has numerous archives across the country. He was very, very well known, and he was someone who I think would have loved to have been an Oscar Heinrich. I think Kaiser was really fascinated with crime and crime scenes, and he loved sort of like the nastiness of it. I think he liked the gossipy part of it. And he was happy to play second fiddle to Oscar Heinrich. And I think that was important. I mean, Oscar needed a buddy who he could bounce ideas off of. Kaiser would send him books. The majority of the books that were donated to UC Berkeley after Heinrich died, UC Berkeley, I think, has more than like 1,000 of his books. Almost all of them were from Kaiser, who had sent him all of these incredible books, and a lot of them unsolicited. He just said, "Hey, I read that you told me in the last letter you're working on this case. Why don't you check out this book?" And so, that was a very important relationship. The most important thing, though, about their relationship was that, I read probably 1,500 to 2,000 of his letters. I have about 4,000. I just couldn't get through the 40s and the 50s. I had to draw the line somewhere. And he and Kaiser wrote back and forth a lot. They were clearly very, very close friends. And I read a lot of letters between Heinrich and his wife. And there is an intimacy there, not a sexual intimacy, an intimacy, emotional intimacy between Kaiser and Heinrich that is not there between Heinrich and his wife. And I'm not surprised by that. I mean, this is the 1920s. I don't think men were trained to be particularly open with their wives. Oscar was very, very proud to keep secret a lot of the financial problems that he was having from Marion, from his wife. He didn't want her to know. That just was not what was going to, be appropriate in society at that time. But he was very, very open, like surprisingly open with Kaiser about emotional issues he was having, professional issues, struggles that he was having internally. I mean, he really was very, very open with this man. And so I think that was very surprising. Had I not had those letters, had John Boynton Kaiser not been the rock star of the libraries in America, and had he not had his own archive where he thankfully collected all of Oscar's letters to him, and Oscar kept all of Kaiser's letters to him. So I'm able to then create this conversation between these two men because they had their own archives and they all matched up by days. I could tell when one of them missed a letter from the other one. And had that not happened, had John Boynton Kaiser not been this man who, deserved to have this collection kept, I wouldn't have the same portrait painted of Oscar Heinrich. It wouldn't be as in depth. It wouldn't be as deep, because the emotional part is one of the things that's most interesting about whoever your central character is in a nonfiction book. And most of the time you find that through letters, at least in the eras that I work, in the 1800s and the early 1900s. And so without those letters, I would have been doomed. It would have been an okay book, but it would not have been as, I think, full of depth as this turned out to be, thankfully.
I agree. Yeah, you really get to know Oscar better through his correspondence with Kaiser. And it's often, sarcastic or complainy or even a little bit funny. It's really interesting reads. And of course, he shared a lot of his cases with Kaiser as well. And as you, I think, just so vividly in this book, really bring those cases to life. But you're also preserving at the same time the mystery of what happened. And I really like that combination. It really engages one's own detective sense. So, for instance, one of the stories that you tell, one of the cases that you talk about is the case of the kidnapped priest, which was almost 100 years ago. Mm-hmm. So there are so many elements to each of these cases where you're talking about the forensic evidence and the eyewitness statements and what Heinrich is doing, what the police are doing, what Heinrich thought about it through his letters. So how do you bring all of those elements of a case together to actually create a full picture of it?
Well, luckily I was able to I had a lot of trial transcripts and newspaper accounts, which were very important. In the case of David Lamson, which is another one of the cases, it wasn't just Heinrich's archive. There were papers from all different types of archive, particularly at Stanford University. So that's very helpful. And with Father Heslin, that case of the kidnapped priest out of Colma, California, there were luckily a lot of newspaper accounts, but Oscar kept a really, really thick file on that. That case really touched him, I think. He wasn't particularly religious, but particularly in that time period in the 1920s, priests were untouchable in certain parts of the country. And to have this really kind of revered priest be kidnapped in such a startling way and then ultimately killed, I think really rocked the nation. And he thought it was very important. So you pull all that stuff together. I did not get to go down to Colma. I would have loved to have gone to Colma where this happened. But being from Northern California, I had made the drive past Colma. So I was really able to kind of put myself there. I think that you start with the place. You start kind of the bird's eye view. So where are we? What's the time period? There are several really great sites, particularly for Colma, that tell you what things were like. I didn't realize that because of the gold rush in the 1800s, San Francisco cemeteries were closed for business. They were full. And so they created this trolley car, railway car to go from San Francisco down to Colma to carry bodies. They were reburying people in Colma. And there's some very famous people. Levi Strauss is buried there. There are famous people buried there partially because of this. And so, little details like that, where you just start going, okay, well, where am I? Okay, I'm in Colma, California. I don't know anything about Colma. Then you find out that it is I think they call it a necropolis, which is essentially like there's more dead people there than alive people. And so, you find that out, and then you kind of link that to the creepiness of the case. And then, you find out about the funeral cars and how they're bringing caskets back and forth. And that kind of all brings in this idea of atmosphere. Now, I am, little secret here, a big fan of like old horror movies. I don't like contemporary ones, but Nosferatu is one of my most favorite. And I have been trying to get a Nosferatu, which is the original Dracula movie from the 1920s. I've been trying to get that reference into one of my books forever. And finally, I had this opportunity with this case because, you have these men searching for this body, and they're kind of like hanging off the side of a cliff going down to the Pacific Ocean, where this crazy man says, I think this is where this body's buried. And so you have to like picture this scene where they just have lanterns and moonlight, and they're tumbling down. All these cops are tumbling, and these reporters are tumbling down this trail. And in the meantime, they're literally filming one of the most cultish horror films ever, Nosferatu, in Europe, and so I can draw these parallels. And it's just me being weird. I mean, but you have that permission when you're an author. It's like, I know that this is happening right now. I know Nosferatu is being filmed, and like the parallels were just too much for me to ignore. And so I think there's just a lot that you pull from. Part of it is, for me, I just dig this stuff. I mean, historical true crime, I avoided saying I was a true crime writer for a really long time. I think that there's kind of a dirtiness feeling about it. True crime, in some ways, feels like you're exploiting the victims. I work really hard to not do that. And I like, the older the better. If I could find a serial killer from the Civil War era or the American Revolutionary era, I would find them. And actually there was, but I'm not interested in their story. So, I like that time period, these really old time periods, Gilded Age. I mean, I just love, and that helps a lot because I'm already in that mindset of like the gas lamps and the fog and Whitechapel and Jack the Ripper and people creep. I mean, I just think that's like my realm. It's what I enjoy reading about and like studying just for having fun, let alone writing a book.
Well, those contextualizations, this is happening at the same time this is happening, I think really ground the story, but it's often also surprising. Oh, wow, I remember that. I can't believe that those two things were happening at the same time. And I think it makes it really fun. When you're talking about, not wanting to be exploitative, like, as a true crime writer, I think the danger is often, or it's perceived as a genre that can be kind of sensationalist, right. Which reminded me of, sort of those kind of conversations that were going on even, back in the 1920s in terms of what is entertainment? What are our entertainment forms doing to the morals of our country? And so it made me think of Fatty Arbuckle and Fatty Arbuckle's case, which was really quite interesting. And I thought, Heinrich often felt he had difficulty testifying to a jury, and Arbuckle seems to, even while Heinrich was testifying against him, basically, to have had some fascination with what he did, and thinking that he mesmerized jurors. So could you talk to us about, you've already sort of mentioned how Heinrich is on the stand, some of the difficulties and even successes that he had in talking to juries, because I think about that, that's still relevant when you have scientific experts talking to juries today in criminal cases.
Yeah, I think that Fatty Arbuckle, yes, certainly had spent many trials watching Oscar Heinrich completely undermine his manslaughter trial. So just for people who don't know, Fatty Arbuckle was a silent film star and the biggest literally and figuratively, silent film star. And he was accused of murder, of manslaughter for the death of a starlet in his suite in 1921. And Oscar Heinrich was the main witness, prosecutorial witness against Fatty Arbuckle. And so Fatty Arbuckle's defense team really gave Heinrich a public dressing down in the trial. I mean, they really ripped him apart on the stand. And Oscar never really forgave Fatty Arbuckle for that. And he struggled after that because, you know, he was constantly trying to explain evidence that was being kind of dissected, you know, by the defense attorney. And it was a big struggle. But I think Fatty Arbuckle still saw Oscar could mesmerize the jury. He was bringing in like giant fingerprint, like posters that he had blown up because he had his own, you know, photo developing lab. And so he brought in like these massive photos where you could see the whorls and the swirls on somebody's fingerprints, and he was explaining it. There was a pizzazz about him. I think the problem is when the pizzazz kind of spills over into being, you know, a little too complicated and almost patronizing in a way. But that Fatty Arbuckle case, like I feel like, I mean, I don't hide Easter eggs because I don't know if authors can really do that, but the Fatty Arbuckle case, you know, I work very much in the realm of wanting to you know, feel like I feel like there's important symbols in all of my books. And so the cover of the book, which is this one, this is actually Fatty Arbuckle's hand. So Oscar had to go to the San Francisco City Jail to fingerprint and to handprint Fatty Arbuckle, which was the beginning of that case. It was all hinging on bad fingerprint evidence. Fatty Arbuckle did not kill this woman, and Oscar was wrong, and yet he managed to ruin Fatty Arbuckle's life for sure. And so I just thought, I told my editor, boy, I really want this hand. I want this photograph because this is Fatty Arbuckle's hand. And even though nobody knows it but me and my editor, like nobody cares. Who cares who that handprint is? Like I know it. And I find it fascinating that, you know, that can be on the cover of the book because, you know, one of the reasons why I write these books, I think, is like just being a part of that history. Like I can't be there. I couldn't experience it, but I can write about it and I can recreate it. And so, you know, I can absolutely visualize Oscar Heinrich, you know, on the stand and the arrogance that I'm sure that he had, that people said he had. But also, you know, as you had sort of alluded to before, we have that problem now. I have a friend who's a defense attorney who I've asked him point blank, you know, he's retired now, how did you pick your witnesses, your expert witnesses? And he said it wasn't always the best qualified person. There's a minimal amount of qualification you have if you are going to take the stand as a ballistics expert or bloodstain pattern analysis. And he said it was always the best talkers. It wasn't the most qualified person. And that is a problem because then you've got person A on the DA side, person B, who is the same type of expert, you know, on the defense's side. And who are you going to believe if you're with a jury? I mean, you know, and you have, let alone a college education or a high school education, you know, when they're talking about really complicated scientific principles, who are you to believe? They ultimately cancel each other out. And then you're left with what? Is there any real evidence you're left with to be able to, you know, prosecute someone or decide guilt or innocence? It's just, you know, I'm wrong. And so I think that is really clearly illustrated when Oscar and his sort of like highfalutin, his arrogance on the stand completely undermines him. And even if his argument is right, there are people who get away with things because Oscar was not clearly understood by the jury.
Yeah. Well, I really appreciated in American Sherlock how you would observe the prejudices like xenophobia, racism, sexism would impact these cases, would even impact eyewitness statements. So, you know, knowing what you know now, and then looking back, you know, are we any better what else, like, what do we need to do to be better, to make our justice system better?
It needs to be less adversarial. Right now, it's a war between the district attorney and defense attorneys, I think. You know, have a lot of people working together, right? It's not the defense attorney's job to find whether or not his client is guilty or innocent. Everybody deserves a defense, right? But I think that you have an awful lot of people with egos who just want to be right, and it doesn't matter how it happens. And I think that we ultimately suffer from that. I mean, you know, there are cases where it is very clear that the person has been wrongfully convicted. There's tons of evidence in some of these cases, and the prosecutors will refuse to look at the cases, even though they know they don't want to be wrong, you know? And I think that, you know, you certainly do have defense attorneys who are shielding things from the prosecutors because they don't want their clients to be convicted or given a heavier sentence. So I think there's dishonesty on all fronts. More honesty, more like looking for the truth and not looking for the win, or, you know, having a better accomplishment or better record. I think less ego and more sort of truth seeking would be great.
We could all use that in general in life, I think.
Yeah.
But yeah, it really drew some strong connections between, you know, things that have happened in the past and how they continue to be issues. And I found it to be not just an interesting book, but it really did change the way that I see how the justice system works, including, you know, presentation of forensic evidence is fantastic. So let's switch gears a little bit. Still kind of on this true crime train. Let's talk about your new podcast, Tenfold More Wicked. I listened to the first episode, and it is so good. It's so engaging. So what can you tell us to pique our interest in the new podcast? The season you're talking about the Scott family and about Edward Roloff?
Ruloff, yes.
Ruloff, yes. Thank you.
So the podcast really, I mean, it's so embarrassing to say this, but the podcast really comes from failed book ideas. So I have a list, as every author would, of things that they think should be books, but they've been told are not books. And so I just said, well, let's make them into podcasts. And this was a book, it was supposed to be a book. And it's about a man named Edward Oscar Heinrich. We'll cut that. We'll start that over. So this is a podcast about a man named Edward Roloff, and he was a genius in the 19th century. He was an expert in linguistics. He spoke a dozen different languages, and he married into a family, and the family finds out pretty quickly that he is a arrogant, self-centered, horrible, violent person who is married to their daughter. And by the end of the season, he has killed 4 members of this family, and they spend 30 years pursuing him. And he, in the meantime, is spending his time developing and perfecting this theory that was revolutionary at the time. And ultimately, I'm not going to ruin it, even though I always ruin all my projects for people. Ultimately, you find out by the end of the season that Edward Roloff put some people in New York in a pretty precarious position when he is finally caught, and we find out, you know, who comes to his defense, and that's pretty surprising, who comes to his defense. And then, you know, ultimately what happens to him and how he made history. And he was very important. So, you know, this podcast for me is so different than writing a book. It's a different kind of a deep dive. So I go to the Scott farm. You get to know a little bit about me. I struggle to climb the snowy hilltop of their cemetery in upstate New York outside of Ithaca. You know, and so I think it's a unique podcast because it's, as me as the narrator, we talk a lot about contemporary issues, about psychopathy, about mental health, about brain scans and the brain defense in courts now. So there's contemporary stuff. There's a lot of historical stuff. There's a lot of what we would call sound design. So like railroad tracks and courts, and like you feel it's an immersive experience. And the most important part is the storytelling in the family. And I have an amazing composer who writes all original music for the podcast. So it's a pretty, I think, unique experience. So it's 3 seasons a year. So this is the first season, and it's called, the season's called All That Is Wicked. And the next season will air at the end of January. And that is set in early 1800s Scotland in Edinburgh, about a pair of serial killers there. So
where can we find your podcast?
So it's on a network called Exactly Right, but it's on Apple Podcasts. It's, again, Tenfold More Wicked. And you can always go to my website, tenfoldmorewicked.com, and I have a newsletter. And it's also on my author website, which is my name, katewinklerdawson.com. But it's anywhere you would listen to podcasts. And of course, podcasts are free, so it's easy to download.
Well, I congratulate you on it because it is fantastic. And I love the way that it is immersive. So you are hearing, the sounds of you exploring this world, and it is really very engaging.
Thank you.
Yeah, I loved it. So what other projects do you have coming up, or what other sort of productive failures you have since the podcast were book ideas? Man, it is a great idea to turn them into a podcast. So what do you have coming up, or what are things that you dream of one day doing?
I think, the podcast has kept me quite busy, and I have another podcast that will be coming out next summer called Wicked Words. And that's where I interview journalists about their best true crime story. So I have a buddy named Brian Burrow, who did a story for Audible. He's with Vanity Fair, and he did a story on the serial killer he went to high school with, and how he went back to high school. He went back to his hometown, 40 something years later, to find out all about this guy. And so I just sit down. These are just like my friends, these are filmmakers and journalists, people I know. And they sit down for about 40 minutes and talk to me about their best story. So that podcast will start next summer. And then I'm starting my 3rd book, which I can't really talk about, but it will be, if you listen to the podcast, when I tell you about the book, you'll feel very familiar with it. So it's exciting. There's a lot happening, juggling a lot.
That's fantastic. Well, our last question always has to be, because we're a library, we're interested not just in what you're writing, but what you're reading. So what have you been reading lately?
Well, I've been reading things for my own books, which has been hard. But what I would really like, I was just talking to my kids about my favorite book of all time, which is, I know that Mark Twain is an answer that a lot of people give for their favorite author, but my favorite book of Mark Twain's is called Pudd'nhead Wilson. Yes. Which is actually really fascinating for like Black Lives Matter right now. It's a really interesting, to me, a really compelling book. And so I managed to read that over the summer when I had a little bit of free time. So I highly recommend Pudd'nhead Wilson. It's just like a social, it's really odd book that seems so, I don't know. I mean, so Mark Twain centered and like really off the rails for him at the same time. So that was my recommendation.
Oh, that's fantastic. Thank you so much, Kate. Yeah. I really enjoyed our conversation. Congratulations again on the book, on your podcast, and I can't wait to read the next book that you come out with.
Thank you. I really appreciate y'all having me. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.